The doll with no daughter. Isabella Romano stood in her late husband's study at midnight, unable to sleep for the third week straight. The Tribeca penthouse was worth $4 million, decorated by the same woman who'd done the Guggenheim's private collection, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson. But every room felt like a tomb now. 21 days since Antonio's execution. 21 days since someone put a bullet in his head at Giovanni's restaurant on Mulberry Street while he was eating lunch. One clean shot. Professional. The kind that said this wasn't rage or revenge. It was business. Enjoying the story? Red heart thumbs up. Like the video. Speech balloon comment where you're watching from. Repeat button. Share with someone. Bell. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The 5 families had sent flowers. Vittorio Castellano, the underboss who'd given the eulogy, promised justice. And Isabella had stood at the funeral in her black Valentino dress and veil, playing the devastated widow everyone expected, while thinking, Antonio knew. He'd been too paranoid those final days, too careful, for this to be a surprise. Tonight, she was packing his belongings. The family would expect her to move out soon. Widows didn't keep penthouses bought with blood money. She'd opened his safe using the code he'd made her memorize. Their wedding date, backwards, with her birth year. Expecting documents, maybe cash, perhaps a gun. Instead, she found a porcelain doll. Expensive, hand-painted, delicate features rendered in exquisite detail. Wrapped in tissue paper with a note in Antonio's distinctive handwriting. For Lucia, with love. Isabella's blood turned to ice. They'd been married 6 years, never had children, never discussed names. Antonio didn't buy gifts without purpose. Every purchase was calculated, every gesture measured. So who the hell was Lucia? She turned the doll over in her hands, and something shifted inside the hollow body. Not loose parts. Something deliberate, weighted, wrong. Isabella found scissors in Antonio's desk and carefully cut the stitching along the doll's back seam. Porcelain cracked slightly as she pried it open, and a small object fell into her palm. A micro SD card, smaller than her thumbnail, unmarked. Her hands shook as she slid it into her laptop adapter. The screen filled with folders, dozens of them, all encrypted with military-grade protection. But one file sat unprotected on the desktop, labeled simply, Bella, watch first. She clicked it. Antonio's face filled the screen. He was in this office, sitting in this chair. Probably days before he died. His dark eyes stared directly into the camera with an intensity that made her chest ache. Bella, his recorded voice said, and she had to grip the desk to stay upright. If you're watching this, I'm already dead. And I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry for what I'm about to put on you. He leaned forward, and she saw the exhaustion in his face, the fear he'd hidden from everyone, including her. The man who kills me isn't our enemy. He's family. Someone we trusted. Someone we ate with. Someone who smiled at our wedding. Antonio's jaw tightened. I found proof. Financial records, recordings, everything. It's all encrypted in these files. But I need you to finish what I couldn't, Bella. I need you to destroy him. He paused, his expression softening. I know you think you gave up everything to marry me. Your career. Your edge. That brilliant mind I fell in love with. But I never forgot who you were before you became my wife. You were the SEC's best forensic accountant. You tracked money through systems these idiots can't even spell. And now I need you to do it one more time. Antonio reached forward, his hand filling the screen. The doll was meant to look innocent, something a grieving widow might ignore. But I knew you'd find it, Bella. I knew you'd investigate anything that didn't make sense. Because you're smarter than all of them combined. The recording ended. Isabella sat in the darkness of her dead husband's office, staring at dozens of encrypted files, and realized Antonio hadn't just left her evidence. He'd left her a war. Chapter 1. Isabella sat at Antonio's desk at 3 a.m., the glow of her laptop, the only light in the study that still smelled faintly of his cologne. Bergamot and cedar, expensive and understated like everything he'd owned. The micro SD card was plugged into an adapter, and she'd been staring at the encrypted files for 2 hours, her forensic accountant brain slowly remembering patterns she hadn't used in 6 years. The SEC had trained her to follow money through shell companies, to trace transactions that men like Antonio spent millions trying to hide. She'd been good at it. Brilliant, actually. Good enough that the bureau chief had personally asked her to reconsider when she'd submitted her resignation letter the week before her wedding. You're throwing away a career, he'd said, looking at her across his cluttered desk with something like pity. For what? To be some mobster's trophy wife? Isabella had smiled politely and said nothing, because explaining that she loved Antonio, genuinely loved him, not his money or power, would have sounded naive to a man who'd spent 30 years prosecuting organized crime. So she'd walked away from the SEC, from the work that had defined her, and learned to be the kind of wife this life required. Silent. Decorative. Forgettable. Now, staring at Antonio's encrypted files, she felt those old skills crackling back to life like electricity through dead wires. The first layer of encryption was almost insultingly simple, a 256-bit AES key that Antonio had embedded in their wedding date reversed. Isabella cracked it in 20 minutes, and found herself looking at a directory structure that made her pulse quicken with recognition. Financial records. Dozens of them. She opened the first spreadsheet and felt her training take over. Column A. Dates spanning 3 years. Column B. Transaction amounts ranging from $50,000 to $500,000. Column C. Source accounts labeled with coded identifiers. Column D. Destination accounts all routing to the same endpoint. Isabella cross-referenced the source codes against what she remembered of the family's operation structure. The gambling operations in Atlantic City. The protection rackets in Brooklyn. The labor union kickbacks from the construction projects in Queens. The drug distribution networks in the Bronx. Every revenue stream the family controlled, systematically skimmed. She pulled up a calculator and started adding. $50,000 here. $125,000 there. $200,000 from the construction unions alone in a single quarter. The numbers climbed with sickening precision, until she reached a total that made her stop breathing. $15.3 million over 3 years. Someone had been stealing from the family. Stealing so carefully, in such small increments, that it would have taken someone with Antonio's meticulous attention to detail to even notice the discrepancies. Isabella opened the next file, audio recordings, timestamped and labeled. She clicked the first one, and her husband's voice filled the study, sending a spike of grief straight through her chest. March 15th, meeting with Castellano, about the Atlantic City quarterly report. He's blaming the casino revenue drop on increased police presence and competition from the new tribal gambling operations. Numbers don't support his explanation. The tribal casinos opened 18 months ago. Our revenue decline started 3 years ago, exactly when Vittorio took over managing the gambling operations. Isabella's hands trembled on the keyboard. Vittorio Castellano, the underboss, the man who'd given the eulogy at Antonio's funeral, speaking about honor and brotherhood, with tears in his eyes. She clicked to the next recording. Antonio's voice again, this time with an edge of barely controlled anger. April 2nd, ran the numbers 3 times. There's no other explanation. Vittorio's been skimming. He's restructured the reporting so the Don only sees aggregated totals, never the detailed breakdowns. He's blaming shortfalls on my operations, making it look like I'm the one losing money, while he's routing the actual revenue to offshore accounts. I need more proof, before I can go to the Don. Accusing the underboss of theft without ironclad evidence is suicide. Isabella felt cold spreading through her body. She opened more files, moving faster now, her forensic training guiding her through Antonio's methodical documentation. Bank statements showing wire transfers from coded accounts to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Corporate registration documents for that shell company, listing Vittorio's cousin as the director. Video footage from what looked like a security camera. Grainy but clear enough to show Vittorio meeting with a man Isabella didn't recognize, accepting an envelope, the timestamp reading 3 days before Antonio's murder. And then, the final file. A video labeled simply, "For Bella." Isabella's finger hovered over the trackpad. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear his voice speaking directly to her, to see his face knowing he'd recorded this while planning for his own death. She clicked it anyway. Antonio appeared on screen, sitting in this same study, probably at this same desk. He looked tired, shadows under his dark eyes, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. But when he looked at the camera, looked at her, his expression softened. "Bella," he said, and she had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. "If you're watching this, I'm already dead. And I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry for what I'm about to ask you to do." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture so familiar it hurt. "I've spent 3 months documenting Vittorio's embezzlement. $15 million over 3 years. Stolen from operations I was managing. Blamed on me to cover his tracks. When I started the audit, I thought it was just accounting errors. By the time I realized it was deliberate theft, I'd already asked too many questions. Vittorio knows I'm close to exposing him. And men like Vittorio don't let people expose them. They eliminate the problem." Antonio leaned closer to the camera. "I've left you everything you need. Financial records proving the embezzlement. Audio recordings of Vittorio blaming me for losses that don't exist. Video evidence of him meeting with the man I'm pretty sure he's hired to kill me. I've even traced the offshore accounts where he's hiding the money." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I go to the Don myself? Why am I putting this on you?" Antonio's eyes were wet now. "Because Vittorio's been careful. He's been positioning himself as the Don's successor, making himself indispensable. If I accuse him without perfect evidence, the Don might not believe me. And if I wait for perfect evidence, Vittorio will kill me first. Isabella watched her husband take a shaky breath. But you, Bella, you're the one person no one will suspect. The quiet wife. The woman who gave up her SEC career to stand beside me at charity galas. Everyone thinks you're just decorative now. They've forgotten what you really are, the smartest forensic accountant I've ever met. He smiled, sad and proud. I need you to do what I can't. Use this evidence. Destroy Vittorio. Expose what he's done. And I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry that I'm asking you to wage a war. I'm not brave enough to finish myself. Antonio reached toward the camera, as if he could touch her face through the screen. I love you. I've loved you from the moment you told me my money laundering schemes were mathematically lazy at that SEC meeting. And my last act, hiding this evidence where only you would find it, in a doll for a daughter we always talked about having someday, is my way of saying I trust you more than I've ever trusted anyone. His expression hardened. The man who kills me is Marco De Luca. Vittorio's promised him my position, and Vittorio himself will pretend to investigate my murder while making sure no one looks too closely at his operations. Antonio's voice dropped to something cold and final. Finish what I couldn't, Bella. Use your mind the way I use my muscle, and teach these men what happens when they underestimate the woman they think is just a widow in a black dress. The video ended. Isabella sat in the darkness of Antonio's study, tears streaming down her face, her forensic accountant brain already organizing the evidence, planning the strategy, calculating the precise moves that would destroy Vittorio Castellano without firing a single shot. Her husband had left her a war, and she was going to win it. Chapter 2. The memorial dinner was held at Carmine's on the Upper East Side, the private dining room where the family conducted business disguised as celebration. Isabella arrived exactly 15 minutes late, early enough to show respect, late enough that she wouldn't have to endure the pre-dinner small talk where men pretended to care about her grief while mentally dividing Antonio's former territory among themselves. She wore Armani black, perfectly tailored, with her dark hair pulled into a severe bun and minimal makeup that emphasized the shadows under her eyes. The performance of grief required careful costuming. Too put together, and they'd think she didn't care. Too disheveled, and they'd question her stability. Isabella had learned in 6 years of marriage that being a mafia wife meant being an actress who never broke character. The room fell silent when she entered. 20 men in expensive suits, their wives and mistresses relegated to a separate table in the corner, all turning to look at the widow. Isabella let her eyes glisten appropriately, let her lower lip tremble just enough to be noticeable, and moved through the room accepting condolences with the fragile dignity everyone expected. Mrs. Romano, my deepest sympathies. That was Michael Greco, one of the capos who ran the Brooklyn operations. His hand on her arm was meant to be comforting but felt like ownership. Antonio was a good man, a loss for all of us. Thank you, Isabella whispered, her voice deliberately soft, broken. He would have appreciated you being here. She moved through the room like a ghost, accepting embraces from men who'd made fortunes from violence, listening to their hollow platitudes about honor and brotherhood, all while her forensic accountant brain cataloged every interaction, every power dynamic, every subtle shift in the hierarchy Antonio's death had created. And then she saw Vittorio Castellano. He stood at the head of the table, exactly where the Don would sit if the Don attended these dinners anymore, which he hadn't in 3 years, delegating the social obligations to his underboss while he managed the empire from his estate in Connecticut. Vittorio was 52, handsome in the way powerful men often are, with silver threading through his dark hair, and the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. He saw Isabella, and his face transformed into practiced sympathy. He crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace that lasted just long enough to be noticed by everyone watching. Isabella, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. I can't tell you how sorry I am. Antonio was like a brother to me, the best lieutenant I've ever worked with. Isabella let herself collapse slightly against him, let him hold her up, aware of every eye on them. Thank you, Vittorio. He respected you so much. He always said, her voice caught perfectly. He always said you were the future of this family. She felt Vittorio's chest expand with pride at the compliment. Over his shoulder she saw several capos exchange glances. The message was received. The widow endorsed Vittorio's ascension, which meant Antonio had endorsed it too. Exactly what Vittorio needed people to believe. Come sit. Vittorio guided her to a chair, not at the main table where business was discussed, but at the wives' table where Isabella belonged now that Antonio wasn't here to elevate her status. You need to eat. You're too thin. Isabella let him seat her among the other women, let him pat her shoulder with paternal concern, and watched him return to the head of the table where the real conversation would happen. The wives immediately surrounded her with the kind of aggressive sympathy that felt more like competition. You poor thing, Maria Greco said. Michael's wife, her Botoxed face frozen in an expression meant to convey concern. 3 weeks. It's still so fresh. How are you managing? Asked Sofia De Luca, and Isabella's attention sharpened. Sofia was Marco's mother, a woman who'd been part of this life for 40 years, and had the kind of observational skills that came from decades of surviving, by staying quiet and paying attention. One day at a time, Isabella murmured, playing with the diamond wedding band she still wore. The apartment is so empty without him. The women made appropriately sympathetic sounds, but Isabella wasn't listening. Her attention was focused on the main table, where the men had started talking business, now that the widow had been properly acknowledged and dismissed to the women's section. Vittorio's voice carried, deliberately pitched for the room to hear. The investigation into Antonio's murder continues. The commission has given us latitude to handle it internally, but we need to be careful. Whoever broke the peace by killing a lieutenant, they need to answer for it publicly. Any leads? That was Tommy Ricci, who ran the drug operations in the Bronx. We're pursuing several lines of inquiry, Vittorio said smoothly. Antonio had been having issues with the Yakuza over territory in Flushing. There's also the possibility it was the Russians making a move. We'll know more soon. Isabella's hands tightened on her water glass. She watched Vittorio expertly redirect attention away from internal possibilities, painting Antonio's murder as external aggression that required a strong leader to address. The men around the table nodded, already accepting his narrative. What about Antonio's operations? Michael Greco asked. The construction unions, the labor contracts. Someone needs to manage them. I'll be assuming temporary oversight, Vittorio said, as if this hadn't been decided before Antonio's body was cold. Until we identify a suitable lieutenant to take over long-term. No mention of the $15 million embezzlement. No acknowledgement that those construction unions had been reporting losses under Vittorio's oversight, while Antonio took the blame. Just smooth transition of power wrapped in the language of duty and responsibility. Isabella looked down at her untouched plate and let a single tear slide down her cheek, visible to the women at her table but not to the men conducting business across the room. Maria Greco squeezed her hand. It's okay to cry, dear. No one expects you to be strong. That's exactly what Isabella was counting on. Her eyes moved around the room, cataloging everything. Vittorio at the head of the table, already acting like the Don in waiting. The capos deferring to him, accepting his version of events. The younger soldiers watching and learning where power was flowing. And then she found Marco De Luca. Antonio's former best friend sat 3 seats down from Vittorio, his plate untouched, his jaw tight. He was 34, handsome in a rough way, the kind of enforcer who did the family's wet work without complaint. He'd been at their wedding, had given a toast about brotherhood that made everyone laugh. He'd been to their apartment for dinner dozens of times, had held Isabella's coat, had called Antonio his brother. Now he wouldn't look at her. Isabella watched him carefully. Every time someone mentioned Antonio's name, Marco's hands would clench. When Vittorio talked about the investigation, Marco took a long drink of wine. And when Michael Greco asked about Antonio's last days, did he seem worried? Like he knew something was wrong? Marco stood abruptly and headed for the bathroom, his chair scraping against the floor. Vittorio watched him go with an expression Isabella couldn't quite read. Then he smiled at the table and said something about Marco taking Antonio's death hard because they'd been so close. The men nodded understandingly and moved on to discussing baseball scores. Isabella sat very still among the women, her head bowed, her shoulders slightly hunched. The perfect picture of a widow drowning in grief, irrelevant to the men running the empire her husband had helped build. None of them noticed her watching. None of them registered how carefully she was observing every interaction, every power play, every slip in the performance they were all giving. That was their first mistake. Chapter 3. Isabella started small. That was the key to psychological warfare. Not the dramatic gesture that would be traced back to its source, but the tiny crack in the foundation that would slowly spread until the entire structure collapsed from within. The first leak went to Michael Greco, the Brooklyn capo who'd patted her arm at the memorial dinner with false sympathy. She sent it through an anonymous encrypted email account routed through 7 different VPN servers, the kind of digital tradecraft the SEC had taught her when tracking money launderers who thought they were untouchable. The email contained a single PDF attachment, 3 months of financial records from the Atlantic City casino operations. Nothing dramatic, just numbers. Revenue reports that Antonio had meticulously documented, showing a discrepancy between what the casinos actually earned and what Vittorio had reported to the Don. Isabella included no message, no explanation. Just the numbers, speaking for themselves. $387,000 in a single quarter that had simply disappeared between the cage count and the official report. Small enough that it might be explained as accounting errors. Large enough that a capo who'd spent 30 years in this life would recognize it as something else entirely. She sent it at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when men like Michael were most likely to be awake, unable to sleep, checking emails they couldn't check during daylight hours when their wives might see. Then she waited. The beauty of information warfare was that you didn't need to convince people of the truth. You just needed to plant questions, let their own paranoia and the culture of constant suspicion that defined this life do the rest. 2 days later, at the regular Thursday sit-down at Carmine's, Isabella watched through the window from across the street, dressed in workout clothes, hair in a ponytail, looking like any other Upper East Side woman getting coffee after yoga. She'd learned surveillance basics from Antonio, who'd found it amusing to teach his forensic accountant wife how to tail someone without being noticed. Through the restaurant window, she could see Michael Greco pull Vittorio aside before the meeting started. Couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language told her everything. Michael's hands gesturing at his phone, his expression tight. Vittorio's carefully controlled face showing the first flicker of concern, then smoothing into practiced calm. Michael was asking questions, and Vittorio was having to answer them. The second leak went to Tommy Ricci 3 days later. This time, Isabella sent labor union records from the Queen's construction projects, the ones Antonio had managed, the ones where Vittorio had blamed revenue shortfalls on increased costs and regulatory complications. Except the documents Isabella sent showed something different. They showed kickback payments being rerouted through a shell company before reaching the family's accounts. Showed contracts being renegotiated at rates that should have increased profit margins, not decreased them. Showed, in the careful notations Antonio had made in the margins, that someone had been systematically skimming from operations they were supposed to be managing, while blaming the losses on the dead lieutenant who could no longer defend himself. Isabella included a single line of text with this leak. Antonio died, asking why the numbers didn't match. Maybe you should ask too. She sent it from a different email account, different VPN configuration, making it impossible to trace and impossible to prove the leaks were connected. As far as Tommy Ricci would know, someone different was asking questions. Multiple sources, multiple concerns. That was how you built paranoia. Not through one massive revelation, but through a dozen small ones that made powerful men start questioning everything they thought they knew. The third leak was more personal. Isabella had discovered in Antonio's files a recording of Vittorio meeting with a banker from the Cayman Islands, the man who managed the offshore accounts where the embezzled money was hidden. The video was grainy security footage, but clear enough to identify faces. Clear enough to show Vittorio accepting papers, shaking hands, making small talk about yacht purchases, and private school tuition for his grandchildren. She sent a 30-second clip to Sal Benedetto, the family's oldest capo, the man who'd served as the Don's consigliere for 20 years. Sal was careful, methodical, the kind of man who'd survived 4 decades in this life by never making assumptions and always verifying information. This time, Isabella's anonymous message was even shorter. Ask Vittorio about Georgetown Wealth Management. Ask him about his grandson's tuition. Because that's what the surveillance footage showed. Vittorio bragging about his grandson starting at Georgetown, an $80,000 a year school, on an underboss salary that was generous but not that generous. Not unless there was money coming from somewhere else. Isabella sent the leak on a Sunday morning, when Sal would be having coffee alone before his wife woke up, when he had time to think without distraction. Then she went to Mass. She'd been attending St. Patrick's Cathedral every Sunday since Antonio's death, playing the grieving Catholic widow seeking comfort and faith. She knelt in the pew, rosary beads threaded through her fingers, and prayed for her husband's soul, while mentally calculating the cascading effect of the information she'd just released. Michael questioning the Atlantic City numbers, Tommy questioning the construction losses, Sal questioning Vittorio's unexplained wealth. 3 different capos, 3 different concerns, all pointing at the same problem. The paranoia would spread organically now. Michael would mention his concerns to someone he trusted. Tommy would do his own digging, find more discrepancies. Sal would ask careful questions, the kind that seemed innocent, but carried weight when they came from the consigliere. And Vittorio would have to answer all of them, while maintaining the performance that he was the loyal underboss, the steady hand guiding the family through the crisis of Antonio's murder. Isabella finished her prayers and lit a candle for Antonio, $20 in the donation box, the flame flickering in the dim cathedral. She stood there for a moment, remembering her husband's face in that final video, remembering his trust that she could finish what he'd started. She was keeping that promise, one calculated leak at a time. The 4th leak came 2 weeks later, and this one went directly to the Don himself. Isabella had agonized over this decision. Going to the Don was dangerous, because it could trigger a response she couldn't control. But she'd watched the previous leaks ripple through the organization, had seen the whispered conversations at funerals and weddings, had noticed the way men looked at Vittorio differently now. The foundation was cracked. Time to start the collapse. She sent the Don a comprehensive financial analysis, the kind of report she used to prepare for the SEC when building cases against money laundering operations. 50 pages documenting 3 years of discrepancies between reported revenue and actual earnings across every operation Vittorio oversaw. She highlighted patterns, showed mathematical impossibilities in Vittorio's explanations for revenue losses, traced the offshore shell company structures back to accounts that, while technically anonymous, followed the same patterns as Vittorio's legitimate investments. She didn't accuse anyone directly. That wasn't how you approached a man like the Don. Instead, she framed it as a concerned analysis from someone who cares about the family's financial health, and suggested a comprehensive audit of all operations to identify where the leaks were occurring. The Don received the report on a Wednesday morning. Isabella knew because she'd hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent who did discreet work for wealthy clients, no questions asked, to watch the Don's estate and confirm delivery. By Wednesday afternoon, according to her investigator's report, 3 black SUVs had arrived at the Don's Connecticut mansion. The kind of emergency meeting that happened when something serious needed to be addressed. By Thursday morning, the family's entire accounting department had been summoned to the estate, along with Vittorio Castellano. Isabella heard about the audit from Sofia De Luca, who'd invited her to lunch under the guise of checking on the grieving widow. They sat at a cafe in Tribeca, and Sofia, who knew everything that happened in this family because she'd learned decades ago that the women who listened carefully heard more than the men who did the talking, leaned across the table with concerned eyes. "Have you heard about the audit?" Sofia asked, her voice low. Isabella shook her head, playing confused. "Audit?" The Dons ordered a complete review of all the family's financial operations. Every account, every business, every revenue stream. Sofia paused significantly. "Vittorio's quite upset about it. Says it shows a lack of trust at a time when the family should be unified." Isabella let her eyes widen with concern. "Is something wrong?" Sofia studied her for a moment, and Isabella wondered if the older woman suspected more than she let on. But then Sofia just patted her hand. "I'm sure it's nothing, dear. Just the Don being careful. You know how he is about the books." Isabella nodded and took a sip of her coffee, hiding her expression behind the cup. The audit would take weeks, maybe months, depending on how deep they went. But Isabella had ensured they'd find exactly what she wanted them to find. Not all the evidence at once, which would seem too convenient, but enough discrepancies to keep digging. Enough questions to keep Vittorio on the defensive. She'd planted the seeds. Now she was watching them grow into the kind of doubt that destroyed empires from within. Because that's what Antonio had understood in his final message to her. Vittorio couldn't be destroyed with violence. He was too well protected, too positioned, too connected. Going after him directly would have meant civil war within the family. But information, questions, the slow erosion of trust that came from numbers that didn't add up, and money that couldn't be explained, that was how you destroyed a man in a world where paranoia was currency, and loyalty was measured in dollars. Isabella finished her lunch with Sofia, accepted her embrace, and walked home through the city Antonio had loved. 3 blocks from her building, she passed a newsstand and saw the headline on the financial section. "Offshore banking scrutiny increases as federal prosecutors target shell companies." Perfect timing. The federal pressure on offshore accounts would make the Don even more nervous about the discrepancies in Vittorio's operations. Isabella bought the newspaper and tucked it under her arm. The widow everyone forgot was orchestrating a symphony of suspicion. And soon, very soon, Vittorio Castellano would realize that the quiet woman in the black Armani dress had been conducting it all along. Chapter 4. Isabella found the recording labeled Marco Final Conversation, 3 weeks into her systematic review of Antonio's files. It was buried deep in a subfolder marked Insurance, time-stamped 36 hours before his death. She almost skipped it. She'd been working through the financial documents methodically, building her case against Vittorio piece by piece. But something about the file name made her pause, made her click play, despite the exhaustion settling into her bones from weeks of late nights at Antonio's desk. Her husband's voice filled the study, and this time, he didn't sound calm or resigned. He sounded heartbroken. "This is the hardest recording I've made, because this one's about Marco." Isabella sat up straighter. Marco De Luca, Antonio's best friend since childhood. The man who'd been best man at their wedding, who'd toasted their happiness with tears in his eyes. "I figured out today why Marco's been avoiding me for the past 3 months, Antonio continued, his voice thick. "Why he won't meet my eyes. Why he's been spending so much time with Vittorio lately." A pause. Antonio's breathing was audible, heavy. "He thinks I killed Gabriella." Isabella's hand flew to her mouth. Gabriella, Antonio's first wife, who'd died in a car accident 5 years ago, 6 months before Isabella met him. Antonio had told her about Gabriella, early in their relationship. The grief still raw in his voice even years later, the way he'd blamed himself for not being there, for being away on family business when her car went off the road in a rainstorm. "I need to explain something," Antonio said on the recording. "Something I never told you, Bella, because it was Marco's secret to keep. But if you're listening to this, I'm dead, and Marco's probably the one who set me up, so you need to understand why." Isabella heard Antonio pour something, whiskey probably, from the crystal decanter he kept on his desk. Marco and Gabriella were having an affair, had been for 2 years before she died. "I didn't know. Neither did Sophia. Marco's mother would have killed him if she'd known he was sleeping with another man's wife, especially mine. They were in love, planning to run away together. Gabriella was going to ask me for a divorce." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She'd known Antonio's first marriage had been troubled. He'd told her that much. But an affair with his best friend. "I found out 3 months after Gabriella died," Antonio continued. "Found her journal. Read everything. The whole 2-year relationship, laid out in her handwriting. How she loved Marco. How they were planning to leave New York together, start over in California where nobody knew us." Another drink. Isabella could hear the ice clinking in the glass. "And here's the thing, Bella. I wasn't even angry. Gabriella and we'd married too young, for the wrong reasons. We were unhappy. The affair was probably the bravest thing she'd ever done. And Marco loved her in a way I never had. So I kept their secret. I burned the journal. I let everyone believe Gabriella had been the faithful wife who died tragically. Let Marco grieve, without anyone knowing he'd lost the love of his life." Antonio's voice turned bitter. "I protected him, protected both their memories. And now he thinks I killed her." Isabella leaned closer to the laptop, her pulse racing. "I had a meeting with Marco yesterday. Forced him to talk to me. Asked him straight out why he's been avoiding me, why he looks at me like I'm his enemy." Antonio laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what he said? He said Gabriella's accident wasn't an accident. Said the car's brake lines had been tampered with. Said I must have found out about the affair, and had her killed to save face." The recording went silent, except for Antonio's breathing. "The fucking brakes, Bella. There was an investigation after Gabriella died. The insurance company looked into it because the accident was so severe. They found no evidence of tampering. The medical examiner confirmed she'd hydroplaned in the rain, lost control, went through the guardrail. It was an accident. A terrible, random accident." Antonio's voice cracked. "But Marco doesn't believe that anymore. Someone's been whispering in his ear, telling him I'm responsible, telling him the investigation was bought off, that I had her killed. And Marco's so eaten up with grief and guilt, that he's choosing to believe it." Isabella heard something slam. Antonio's fist against the desk. "Probably. I know who's been feeding him this bullshit. Vittorio. Has to be. Marco's been spending time with him, and suddenly he's convinced I'm a wife killer. It's too convenient, too perfectly timed with my investigation into the embezzlement." The pieces were clicking together in Isabella's mind, with sickening clarity. "Vittorio's using Marco's grief as a weapon," Antonio said, and Isabella could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "He's found Marco's weak spot, the guilt over Gabriella, the pain of losing her, and he's twisted it into something that makes Marco hate me. Makes him want revenge for a crime I never committed." Antonio took another drink. "I tried to tell Marco the truth yesterday. Told him I knew about the affair, that I'd forgiven them both years ago, that Gabriella's death was an accident, and I'd spent 5 years wishing I'd been there to prevent it. You know what he said? He said I was a good liar. Said of course I'd deny it now that he'd figured out the truth." The recording went quiet for a long moment. "So here's what I know, Bella. Marco's gonna help Vittorio kill me. Maybe he's already agreed to it. Maybe he's the one who'll set up the hit, because he knows my routines, knows where I'll be, knows how to get past my security. He'll do it thinking he's avenging the woman he loved. And he'll never know that Vittorio manufactured the whole thing. The suspicion, the paranoia, the convenient evidence that made an accident look like murder." Antonio's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's what makes this so fucking tragic. Marco's not a bad man. He's a good man, who's been weaponized by someone who understands that grief makes people vulnerable to believing the worst. Vittorio found Marco's open wound and poured poison into it until it infected everything." Isabella heard papers rustling. "I've included evidence in the files, the original accident investigation, the insurance company's report, the medical examiner's findings. All of it proves Gabriella's death was exactly what it looked like. A woman driving too fast in a rainstorm, losing control on a dangerous curve. No tampering, no murder, just bad luck and bad weather." Antonio's voice turned gentle, the way it did when he used to talk to Isabella late at night. "If you're listening to this, and if Marco was involved in my death, I need you to understand something. He's a victim too. Vittorio manipulated him into becoming a murderer, by convincing him he was seeking justice. That doesn't excuse what Marco did, but it means he's not the real enemy. A pause. The real enemy is the man who understands that the best way to turn a good man into a killer is to give him a dead woman to avenge and a convenient villain to blame. The recording ended. Isabella sat in the darkness of Antonio's study, her hands shaking. She thought about Marco at the memorial dinner, the way he couldn't meet her eyes, the guilt that radiated from him every time Antonio's name was mentioned. He thought he'd avenged Gabriella, thought he'd killed the man who'd murdered the love of his life. And instead, he'd killed the only person who'd protected their secret, who'd honored their love story even after Gabriella's death, who'd never blamed either of them for betraying him. Isabella opened the evidence folder Antonio had referenced, found the accident investigation report, complete and thorough. Found the insurance company's analysis showing no signs of tampering. Found the medical examiner's conclusion, accidental death due to loss of vehicle control in inclement weather. Found photographs of the crash site, the guardrail Gabriella's car had gone through, the embankment she'd rolled down, the tree that had finally stopped the vehicle's descent. The kind of impact that spoke of speed and weather, and terrible luck, not murder. Marco had believed a lie, had committed murder based on that lie, and Vittorio had crafted the entire deception, knowing that a man consumed by grief and guilt would accept any explanation that gave his pain a target. Isabella closed the files and opened a new document on her laptop. She'd been planning to destroy Vittorio financially, to use the embezzlement evidence to turn the family against him. But this was something different. This was proof that Vittorio was the kind of man who would manipulate a grieving lover into murdering his best friend, who would take Marco's love for Gabriella and pervert it into a weapon. And Marco needed to know the truth, not because it would absolve him. Nothing could absolve murder, but because he deserved to understand that he'd been used. That the man he'd killed had actually been the one person who'd protected what he and Gabriella had shared. Isabella began typing, her forensic accountant precision now focused on assembling not just financial evidence but the complete story of Vittorio's manipulation, how he'd found Marco's vulnerability, how he'd exploited it, how he'd turned a best friend into an assassin through careful lies and manufactured evidence. This wasn't just about embezzlement anymore. This was about showing the family exactly what kind of man Vittorio Castellano was. Someone who didn't just steal money, but who stole people's grief and turned it into murder. And Isabella was going to make sure everyone knew it, especially Marco. Because there was a special kind of justice in making a man realize he'd killed the wrong person. And an even more devastating justice in making him understand that the man who'd convinced him to do it was the one who deserved his vengeance all along. Chapter 5. The audit had been running for 6 weeks when Vittorio Castellano realized he was being hunted. It started with small things. The way Michael Greco's questions during the Thursday sit-downs had grown sharper, more pointed. The way Tommy Ricci had begun cross-referencing his own records against the reports Vittorio submitted. The way Sal Benedetto watched him with the kind of patient, assessing silence that came from 40 years of identifying liabilities. But the real warning sign came when the Don's accountants found the first major discrepancy. Vittorio was summoned to the Connecticut estate on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of summons that didn't allow for excuses or delays. He drove through the gates of the Don's compound with his jaw tight and his mind racing through explanations, justifications, stories that would make the numbers make sense. The Don received him in the study, a room lined with first-edition books that Vittorio suspected the old man had never read. At 73, Don Carmine Rossetti still commanded absolute authority, not through violence, which he'd delegated decades ago, but through the kind of quiet power that came from owning half the politicians in New York, and all the leverage that mattered. "Sit," the Don said, not looking up from the financial reports spread across his desk. Vittorio sat, waited. The silence stretched. "The Atlantic City casinos," the Don finally said, his voice carrying the faint accent of his Sicilian childhood. "The auditors found interesting patterns. Revenue declining steadily over 3 years, but the casino managers report different numbers than what appears in our books. I've been investigating those discrepancies," Vittorio said smoothly. "I believe Antonio may have been." "Don't." The Don's eyes lifted from the papers, and Vittorio felt ice spread through his chest. "Don't insult my intelligence by blaming a dead man who kept meticulous records." The Don pushed a folder across the desk. Vittorio opened it and felt his careful world begin to crack. Inside were financial analyses he'd never seen. Detailed breakdowns showing the exact pattern of his skimming. Comparisons between reported revenue and actual earnings. Notes and margins pointing out mathematical impossibilities in his explanations for losses. Someone had done forensic accounting, professional-level work. Where did these come from? Vittorio asked, keeping his voice level. Anonymous submission. Very thorough, very accurate. The Don leaned back in his chair. The kind of analysis that requires either law enforcement expertise or someone with significant financial training. Vittorio's mind raced. Law enforcement would have raided, not sent anonymous reports, which meant someone inside or adjacent to the family. Someone who understood their operations intimately enough to know where to look for discrepancies. Someone Antonio would have trusted with this information. I want to know who's spreading these lies, Vittorio said, putting just enough anger in his voice. Antonio's death has created chaos, and someone's taking advantage of it to undermine the family's stability. Find out, the Don said simply. And Vittorio, find out fast. Because if these numbers are accurate, and my accountants believe they are, then we have a serious problem. And serious problems get solved permanently. The threat was clear. Vittorio left the estate with his hands steady on the steering wheel, and his mind calculating survival. Someone had Antonio's evidence. Someone had been systematically leaking it, creating doubt, turning the family against him piece by piece. And there was only one person Antonio would have trusted with that kind of information. His wife. Vittorio had dismissed Isabella Romano from the moment Antonio married her. The quiet analyst who'd given up her SEC career to play trophy wife, who'd spent 6 years being decorative at charity events and invisible during business discussions. He'd watched her at the memorial dinner, crying prettily into her handkerchief, accepting condolences with trembling gratitude. He'd assumed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a widow drowning in grief, irrelevant to the empire her husband had left behind. But forensic accounting required specific expertise. The SEC hired people who could track money through complex criminal enterprises, and Isabella Romano had worked for the SEC before she'd married Antonio. Vittorio pulled over on the side of the highway and made a call. I need information, he told his private investigator, the one who handled sensitive matters off the books. Isabella Romano. I want to know everything she's done since Antonio died. Every person she's met with, every place she's gone, every computer she's accessed. And I want to know her work history at the SEC, specifically, what kind of cases she worked. The investigator called back 3 hours later. She worked financial crimes, he reported, specialized in tracking money laundering and organized crime finances, was considered one of their best analysts before she resigned to get married. As for her recent activity, she's been quiet, stays home mostly, attends mass on Sundays, had lunch with Sofia DeLuca a few times. Nothing suspicious on the surface. Her computer activity? Uses a VPN service, multiple encrypted email accounts, the kind of digital security someone uses when they don't want to be traced. Vittorio closed his eyes. A grieving widow didn't need that level of operational security, but someone leaking evidence to destroy an underboss did. One more thing, the investigator added. I checked her phone records. She's been making regular calls to the same Connecticut number. It's registered to a law firm that specializes in estate planning and asset protection. Preparing her exit strategy. Getting ready to disappear once she'd finished destroying him. Vittorio ended the call and sat in his car, watching traffic stream past on the highway, calculating his options. He could go to the Don, accuse Isabella directly, but without proof that she had Antonio's evidence, he'd look paranoid. Worse, it would confirm that there was evidence to have, that Antonio had been documenting the embezzlement, that the accusations had substance. He could have her killed immediately. But if she'd set up a dead man's switch, the kind of fail-safe someone with SEC training would absolutely implement, her death would trigger the release of everything Antonio had collected. The evidence would flood the FBI, the commission, every family boss who mattered. No, he needed the evidence first. Needed to know what Antonio had documented, where it was stored, how it could be destroyed. Then he could eliminate the widow. Vittorio made another call, this one to Marco DeLuca. We need to talk, Vittorio said. Tonight. The usual place. They met at a warehouse in Red Hook, the kind of location where conversations happened that couldn't be overheard. Marco arrived, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks, the guilt of Antonio's murder eating him alive from the inside. Perfect. Guilt made men malleable. The widow's causing problems, Vittorio said without preamble. She has information Antonio gathered before his death. Financial records that could hurt the family. Marco's jaw tightened. What kind of information? The kind that raises questions about operations I manage. The kind Antonio was investigating before he was killed. Vittorio let that sink in. The kind that could expose everyone involved in his death. Marco went pale. She knows. She's figuring it out. And if she takes what she knows to the wrong people, we're both dead. You for setting up the hit. Me for ordering it. What do you want me to do? Vittorio handed Marco a small device, a GPS tracker. Put this on her car. Find out where she goes, who she meets with. I need to know if she's working with law enforcement, if she's planning to testify, if she's built a case. And then you go to her apartment. You retrieve whatever evidence Antonio left her. Computer, files, recordings, everything. And you make sure she can't cause any more problems. Marco stared at the tracker. You want me to kill Antonio's widow? I want you to protect yourself, Vittorio corrected. She's not the grieving wife anymore, Marco. She's become a threat, and threats get eliminated. She's just a woman. She's a former SEC analyst who specialized in financial crimes, Vittorio interrupted. She's been systematically leaking evidence that's destroying my credibility with the Don. She's playing a game she learned from the federal government, and she's winning. Marco's hands clenched around the tracker. Antonio trusted her with his evidence because he knew she was smart enough to use it, Vittorio continued. And right now, she's using it to take us both down, unless we stop her first. Vittorio watched the internal struggle play out on Marco's face. The young enforcer had already crossed the line by helping kill his best friend. One more murder, especially one framed as protecting himself from exposure, wouldn't be that much harder to justify. When? Marco asked finally. Soon. Within the week, before the Don's audit finds something that can't be explained away. Vittorio put his hand on Marco's shoulder. I know this is hard, but Antonio's widow isn't the innocent woman she pretends to be. She's weaponizing his death against us. And if we don't act first, we're the ones who'll end up in the ground. Marco nodded slowly, pocketing the tracker. Vittorio watched him leave and felt the familiar satisfaction of a problem being solved. Isabella Romano thought she was clever, thought she could hide behind her widow's weeds while destroying his empire with numbers and leaks. She didn't understand that in this world, intelligence was meaningless if you weren't willing to kill to protect it. And she was about to learn that the quiet widow everyone forgot could still bleed like anyone else. Vittorio made one final call that night, to a cleaner, who specialized in making bodies disappear. I may need your services soon, Vittorio said. A woman. Make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. Tribeca apartment. Wealthy widow, the kind of target criminals would choose. When? I'll let you know. Just be ready. Vittorio ended the call and poured himself a drink. Within a week, maybe two, Isabella Romano would be dead. Her evidence would be destroyed. The audit would find nothing that couldn't be explained. And the quiet widow who'd thought she could wage war with spreadsheets and anonymous emails would learn the oldest lesson in organized crime. In the end, violence always won. Or so Vittorio believed. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, because he'd underestimated Isabella from the beginning, was that she'd been expecting this move, had planned for it, had prepared for the moment when Vittorio would realize she was the threat, and send someone to eliminate her, and she'd built her trap accordingly. The hunter had become the hunted. But the real question was, who had been hunting whom all along? Chapter 6. Isabella was awake when Marco De Luca picked the lock on her penthouse door at 2:17 a.m. She'd been expecting him for 3 days, ever since her private investigator had reported the GPS tracker on her car and the surveillance team watching her building. She'd known the moment Vittorio connected her to the leaks that he would send someone to retrieve the evidence and eliminate the problem. And she'd known he would send Marco, the man who'd already murdered once for Vittorio, who had the most to lose if Antonio's evidence exposed the conspiracy, who could be manipulated into believing that killing her was self-preservation rather than just another murder. She sat in Antonio's leather chair in the study, the room dark except for the glow of her laptop screen. She wore black silk pajamas and had her hair down, playing the role of the widow who couldn't sleep, who spent her nights in her dead husband's office drowning in grief and memories. The gun on the desk beside her laptop was real. A Glock 19, Antonio's backup piece that he'd taught her to shoot at a range in Westchester, back when he'd still believed his enemies might come for his family and she'd need to defend herself. He'd been right about the enemies, just wrong about which ones. Isabella heard Marco move through the apartment with professional quiet, checking rooms systematically. She didn't move, didn't call out, just waited with her hands folded calmly on the desk as his footsteps approached the study. When he appeared in the doorway, gun raised and silencer attached, she didn't flinch. Hello, Marco, she said, her voice steady. He froze, clearly expecting to find her asleep in bed, vulnerable and unaware, not sitting at her husband's desk, like she'd been waiting for him. Mrs. Romano, he said, and she heard the strain in his voice. I need you to step away from the computer. No. Isabella kept her hands visible, non-threatening. But you can come in. We should talk. I'm not here to talk. I know why you're here. Vittorio sent you to retrieve Antonio's evidence and kill me. Isabella's tone was conversational, academic. The question is whether you're going to go through with it, or whether you're finally ready to hear the truth about Gabriella. Marco's gun hand trembled. Don't say her name. Gabriella Russo, born March 3, 1985. Died November 12, 5 years ago, when her car went off Route 9 during a rainstorm. You loved her. She loved you. And you think Antonio had her killed when he found out about your affair? Shut up. Marco stepped into the study, gun steady now, aimed at her chest. you don't know anything about. I know everything. Isabella's voice was gentle, the same tone she used to use when explaining complex financial crimes to juries. Antonio knew about the affair. He knew you and Gabriella were planning to run away to California together. He knew she was going to ask him for a divorce. Marco's face went white. He told you? No. He recorded a message for me before he died. Explained everything. Isabella gestured to the laptop. It's all there. The accident investigation. The insurance reports. The medical examiner's findings. All of it proving that Gabriella's death was exactly what it looked like. A terrible accident. No tampering, no murder. Just bad luck and bad weather. You're lying, Marco said, but his voice cracked. The brakes were cut. Vittorio showed me the evidence. Vittorio showed you fabricated evidence. Isabella opened a file on her laptop, turned the screen, so Marco could see. This is the actual police report. The actual insurance investigation. Every mechanic who examined that car confirmed the same thing. The brakes failed due to wear and wet conditions, not sabotage. Marco moved closer despite himself, his eyes scanning the documents on the screen. Antonio didn't kill Gabriella, Isabella continued. He mourned her. He protected both of your secrets, even after her death. He burned her journal so no one would ever know about the affair, so you could grieve without shame. So Gabriella could be remembered as the faithful wife instead of the woman who'd fallen in love with her husband's best friend. No. Marco's gun was shaking now. No, that's not. Vittorio said. Vittorio lied to you. Isabella's voice hardened. He found your vulnerability, the guilt over Gabriella, the pain of losing her, and he weaponized it. He convinced you that Antonio was responsible for her death, because he needed you to set up the murder. And you did it. You helped kill the one person who'd protected what you and Gabriella shared. Marco's face crumpled. The gun dropped slightly. Where is it? He asked hoarsely. Where's the micro SD card? The evidence Antonio left you? Isabella reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the porcelain doll. The one Antonio had hidden the evidence in. The gift for Lucia that had started everything. Right here, she said. Marco lunged forward, reaching for the doll, and Isabella did something that stopped him cold. She dropped it. The porcelain shattered on the hardwood floor with a sound like bones breaking. Pieces scattered everywhere. The delicate face, the painted dress, the hollow body that had held Antonio's final gift to his wife. Marco fell to his knees, frantically searching through the shards, his gun forgotten on the floor beside him. What did you do? What the fuck did you? Did you really think I'd keep the only copy in a doll? Isabella's voice was cold now. The forensic accountant who'd once tracked criminal enterprises for the federal government. I'm not sentimental, Marco. I'm methodical. Marco looked up at her, porcelain dust on his hands, and she saw the moment he understood. I uploaded everything Antonio left me to 3 separate cloud servers the same night I found the micro SD card, Isabella said. Financial records, audio recordings, video footage, the complete documentation of Vittorio's embezzlement, and your role in Antonio's murder. All of it encrypted, time-stamped, authenticated. She leaned forward in the chair. And each server is connected to a dead man's switch. If I don't enter a password every 24 hours, the system automatically sends everything to pre-programmed recipients. The FBI field office in Manhattan, the New York Times investigative desk, and all 5 family bosses, including the commission. Marco went very still. So here's your situation, Isabella continued, her voice measured and precise. You can kill me right now. Use that gun you brought. Eliminate the widow who refuses to disappear. But the moment I don't enter tomorrow's password, 48 hours of chaos begins. Federal agents raid Vittorio's operations. Journalists publish everything Antonio documented. The 5 families learn that Vittorio's embezzlement has been threatening the peace treaty you all pretend to honor. She stood, walked around the desk, and looked down at Marco kneeling in the shattered remains of the doll. Or, she said softly, you can leave. You can walk out of this apartment and spend the next 12 hours running. Because whether you kill me or not, I'm releasing the evidence tomorrow night. I've already made that decision. The only question is whether you're still here when it happens. Marco stared up at her, and Isabella saw the exact moment he realized he'd been outmaneuvered by the woman everyone had dismissed as the quiet wife. Why? He asked hoarsely. Why give me a chance to run? Because Antonio's final message said you were a victim too, Isabella said. Vittorio manipulated your grief into murder. That doesn't excuse what you did. But it means you were a weapon he used, not the hand that wielded it. She walked back to the desk, picked up her phone. The hand that wielded it was Vittorio Castellano. And he's the one who's gonna pay for everything. You're just collateral damage. So take the 12 hours I'm offering you and disappear, Marco. Because when the evidence goes public, the FBI will be looking for you. And so will the families. And if I kill you anyway? Marco's hand moved toward the gun on the floor. Then you prove Vittorio right, that you're nothing but a weapon to be pointed at whoever he needs dead. Isabella's voice was ice. Or you can prove Antonio right, that you're a good man who was turned into a killer through manipulation. Your choice. Marco looked at the gun. Looked at Isabella standing calm and controlled in her dead husband's study. Looked at the shattered doll that had held his best friend's final accusation. And slowly he stood up, back toward the door. Left the gun on the floor. He loved her, Marco said, tears streaming down his face. Antonio loved Gabriella, in his way, not the way you did. But enough to protect both of you, even after death. Isabella's expression softened slightly. He forgave you, Marco. For the affair. For everything. The only person he couldn't forgive was Vittorio. And now I'm finishing what Antonio started. Marco nodded once, turned, and left. Isabella waited until she heard the apartment door close, before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking now. Adrenaline, finally catching up with the performance of calm she'd maintained. She walked to the window overlooking the Hudson and pulled out her phone. Sent a single text message to a number she'd programmed weeks ago. Guest has left. Proceed with phase 2. Tomorrow night, at midnight, the dead man's switches would activate. But not because she'd failed to enter the password, because she'd chosen to trigger them manually. Vittorio Castellano thought he'd sent Marco to eliminate a problem. Instead, he'd sent him to confirm everything Isabella needed confirmed. That Vittorio was desperate enough to order her death. That the evidence was damaging enough to kill for. That the quiet widow everyone had dismissed was actually the most dangerous person in this entire game. Isabella looked at the shattered doll on the floor. The porcelain pieces that had once held Antonio's final gift. His last trust in her intelligence and capability. I'm finishing it, she whispered to the broken remnants. Just like you asked. Tomorrow night, Vittorio's empire would crumble. Not from bullets or bombs, but from information released with surgical precision to every authority that mattered. And the widow everyone forgot would be the one who'd orchestrated the entire collapse. 3 steps ahead, just like Antonio had trusted she would be. Chapter 7. Marco stood in Isabella's study for 30 seconds after she'd told him to run, his mind clearly racing through impossible calculations. Then he pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed. Put it on speaker, Isabella said quietly. I want to hear this. Marco's thumb hesitated over the screen, then pressed the button. The phone rang twice before Vittorio's voice filled the study, smooth and controlled even at 2:47 a.m. Is it done? Not yet, Marco said, his voice rough. There's a problem. A pause. Isabella could hear Vittorio's breathing shift, the subtle tell of a man recalculating rapidly. What kind of problem? The kind where she uploaded everything to cloud servers with dead man's switches, Marco said, looking at Isabella as he spoke. The kind where killing her triggers the automatic release of all of Antonio's evidence to the FBI, the press, and every family boss. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Isabella wondered if Vittorio had hung up. Then his voice came back, harder now, the smooth facade cracking. Let me talk to her. Marco held out the phone. Isabella took it, brought it close to her mouth, and spoke with the same measured precision she'd once used when presenting evidence to federal prosecutors. Hello, Vittorio, Mrs. Romano. The false sympathy was gone from his voice now. It seems you've been busier than anyone realized. I've been finishing what my husband started, Isabella said, exposing the man who embezzled $15 million and had him killed to cover it up. You're making a mistake. Whatever Antonio told you, whatever he thought he knew, it's more complicated than that. There are nuances, context. I have 3 years of financial records documenting your theft, Isabella interrupted. I have audio recordings of you blaming Antonio for losses that didn't exist. I have video footage of you meeting with offshore bankers to move the money you stole. There's no nuance in embezzlement, Vittorio. Just numbers that don't lie. She heard him take a breath, shift tactics. Let's talk about this reasonably, Vittorio said, his voice turning conciliatory. You're a smart woman. You understand how business works. What Antonio documented, yes, there were some financial irregularities, but they were necessary for the family's operations. Sometimes money needs to move in ways that don't appear in the books. That's not theft, that's management. $15 million in 3 years, Isabella said. Routed to shell companies registered to your relatives. Used to buy your grandson's Georgetown tuition, your daughter's house in the Hamptons, your yacht. That's not management. That's embezzlement. You don't understand our world. I understand numbers. And numbers don't care about your world or mine. They just tell the truth. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Calculating. Transactional. What do you want? Money. I can arrange a very generous settlement. $10 million. transferred anywhere you specify. You destroy the evidence, sign an NDA, and live the rest of your life very comfortably. No one needs to know what Antonio found. Isabella looked at Marco, still standing in her study with guilt and grief written across his face. Looked at the shattered porcelain doll on the floor. Looked at Antonio's leather chair, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. My husband was worth more than money, she said quietly. Everyone has a price. You made a mistake, Vittorio. Isabella's voice cut through his pitch with surgical precision. You killed the man I loved and expected me to be grateful for the condolence flowers. You thought I'd wear black and fade away like a good widow should. You underestimated me because I'm a woman, because I gave up my career to marry Antonio, because I knew how to be quiet when powerful men were talking. She walked to her laptop, opened the dead man switch interface she'd built weeks ago. Now I'm going to teach you what happens when you underestimate a widow who used to track organized crime finances for the federal government. Wait. Vittorio's voice shifted to alarm. Whatever you're thinking of doing, let's talk first. Let's meet. Face to face, we can work this out. We're done talking, Isabella said. And she pressed enter. The dead man switch interface lit up with confirmation messages. Files uploading, encryption keys releasing. Automated emails queuing to recipients across government agencies, media organizations, and the encrypted networks where family bosses communicated. 3 years of Antonio's meticulous documentation, spreading like a virus through the digital infrastructure of New York's criminal underworld. What did you just do? Vittorio's voice came through the phone speaker, tight with panic now. I released everything, Isabella said calmly. The financial records showing your embezzlement. The audio recordings of you manipulating Marco into believing Antonio killed Gabriella. The video evidence of your offshore banking meetings. The complete timeline of how you stole $15 million and murdered a lieutenant to cover it up. She checked her laptop screen. The upload progress bars were moving steadily. In approximately 7 minutes, the FBI field office in Manhattan will receive encrypted files containing detailed evidence of your financial crimes. In 10 minutes, the New York Times investigative desk will get documentation they can verify through independent sources. In 15 minutes, every boss in the 5 families will have access to proof that you've been stealing from operations and blaming it on a dead man. You're insane, Vittorio said. Do you have any idea what you've just done? This doesn't just hurt me. This exposes the entire organization. The families will know exactly who to blame, Isabella interrupted. You, the underboss who betrayed their trust, who murdered one of their own to cover his theft, who would have kept stealing if Antonio hadn't started asking questions. She watched the progress bars complete, files sent, evidence delivered. You built your empire on people underestimating the quiet ones, Isabella continued. The women who smiled at Gallus. The widows who wore black and disappeared. The wives who were supposed to be decorative and silent. You thought we didn't listen, didn't understand, didn't matter. The laptop chimed. Confirmation that the FBI had received the files. But we heard everything. We understood more than you knew. And we mattered a hell of a lot more than you ever imagined. Another chime. The New York Times confirming receipt. Antonio trusted me with his evidence, because he knew I was the only person smart enough to use it, and patient enough to wait for the right moment. He died knowing I would finish what he started. And I'm keeping that promise. The Don will kill you for this, Vittorio said, desperation clear in his voice now. You've exposed family business. That's a death sentence. The Don will thank me, Isabella corrected. I'm handing him proof that his underboss has been stealing millions and framing a loyal lieutenant for it. I'm giving him the truth about who really betrayed the family. And I'm doing it with documentation so thorough that he can't ignore it, can't bury it, can't pretend it doesn't exist. Final chime. The encrypted network confirming delivery to all 5 family bosses. It's done, Isabella said. In the next hour your phone is going to start ringing. The Don will summon you. The FBI will start moving on your offshore accounts. The other families will demand answers about why their peace treaty has been threatened by your embezzlement. And by dawn, everyone who matters will know exactly what you did. She paused, letting the silence stretch. You killed my husband with a bullet, Isabella said softly. I'm killing your empire with spreadsheets and evidence. Let's see which one does more damage. She ended the call. Marco stood frozen in her study, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time. You just declared war on the entire underworld. No, Isabella corrected. I just won it. Her phone began buzzing almost immediately. Text messages flooding in from numbers she recognized. Journalists, federal contacts, even an encrypted message from someone identifying themselves as representing the Don. Isabella ignored them all. She walked to the window overlooking the Hudson, where the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky, and allowed herself a small smile. Somewhere in the city, Vittorio Castellano was realizing that the quiet widow he'd dismissed had just destroyed everything he'd built. That the woman he'd sent Marco to eliminate had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. That underestimating her had been the fatal mistake that would cost him his empire, his freedom, and probably his life. Behind her, Marco's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his face went white. "It's already spreading," he said hoarsely. "The family group chats. Everyone's getting the evidence. They're reading Antonio's recordings, seeing the financial documents. The Don just called an emergency meeting for sunrise." "Then you should run," Isabella said without turning around. "You have maybe 3 hours before the FBI starts making arrests. Use them." "What about you?" "I'll be fine." Isabella's reflection in the window showed a woman who looked nothing like the grieving widow who'd sat through memorial dinners in black Armani. "I have documentation proving I was Antonio's wife, not his accomplice. I have evidence showing I cooperated with law enforcement by providing everything he'd collected. And I have a very good lawyer who specializes in witness protection negotiations." She finally turned to face Marco. "You helped kill my husband because Vittorio convinced you it was justice. Now you know it was murder based on a lie. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But my advice, disappear before the people you betrayed for Vittorio decide you're more valuable dead than alive." Marco looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once and left. Isabella waited until she heard the apartment door close before she let herself sink into Antonio's chair. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally crashing. She'd done it, finished what Antonio had asked her to finish. Used the intelligence he'd trusted her to have, and the courage he'd believed she possessed. The widow everyone forgot had just reminded the entire underworld that being underestimated was the most powerful weapon in existence. And sometimes, the quietest voice in the room was the one that burned empires to the ground. Chapter 8. 6 months had passed since the night Antonio died in her arms, and Isabella Russo sat behind a Monterey desk that had once belonged to her husband. The office overlooked the East River, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that now bent to her will in ways the men who built it never imagined possible. The legitimate operations ran with surgical precision under her command. The gambling establishments produced clean revenue, meticulously documented and taxed. The real estate holdings expanded into development projects that brought jobs and infrastructure to neighborhoods the city had forgotten. The labor unions, once bleeding money through corruption, now negotiated contracts that actually protected workers while maintaining profitability. It was remarkable what happened when you ran criminal enterprises like legitimate businesses instead of pretending legitimate businesses were criminal enterprises. She'd inherited none of this through marriage, despite what the old guard initially assumed. In those first chaotic weeks after Antonio's death, when Vittorio's betrayal hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, the wolves had circled. They saw a widow. They saw weakness. They saw an opportunity to carve up Antonio's territory like a Christmas turkey. They hadn't seen Isabella. The revelation of Vittorio's treachery had sent shockwaves through the commission. Audio recordings, financial documents, photographs of meetings with the Colombians, all delivered to the Don in a leather portfolio by Isabella herself, 3 days after she buried her husband. She'd presented the evidence without tears, without theatrics, speaking in the same calm, analytical tone she might use to discuss quarterly earnings. Antonio suspected for months, she'd told the Don, seated across from him in his book-lined study, while armed men pretended not to listen from the hallway. He documented everything. He died protecting the family from a cancer that had metastasized. The Don had listened, his weathered face unreadable, as he reviewed document after document. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes Isabella had never seen before. Respect, tinged with regret. "I doubted him," the old man admitted, his voice rough with age and something that might have been shame. "I questioned his judgment, his loyalty, and he died proving me wrong." "He died protecting what he built," Isabella corrected gently. "And now someone needs to continue that work." The silence that followed stretched like taffy. Then the Don nodded, a single decisive movement of his gray head. "You have his mind," he said. "The question is whether you have the stomach for this life." Isabella had smiled then, a small, knowing expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Don Castellano, I've had the stomach for this life since I was balancing Antonio's books in our apartment in Queens. The only difference is now I don't have to pretend I'm just the wife." Vittorio was dead within the week, executed by his own cousin in a basement in Staten Island. The poetic justice wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd orchestrated Antonio's murder met his end at the hands of family, just as Antonio had. Marco Santoro, Vittorio's second-in-command and the architect of the ambush, was currently serving a 20-year federal sentence after a sudden epidemic of cooperation from witnesses who'd previously suffered collective amnesia. Isabella hadn't ordered either outcome. She hadn't needed to. Once the truth emerged, the Commission's machinery ground forward with its own inexorable logic. Justice in their world was swift and brutal, and the fact that Isabella had delivered the evidence that set it in motion only enhanced her reputation. The men who'd dismissed her as Antonio's decorative widow discovered she'd been his true partner all along. The financial systems he'd implemented, the diversification strategies, the careful cultivation of political connections, Isabella's fingerprints were all over them. She knew every account, every contact, every lever of power Antonio had built because she'd helped build them. Transitioning the operations to full legitimacy was her innovation, her vision. Antonio had started the process, but Isabella accelerated it with a ruthlessness that would have made her husband proud. She purged the dead weight, the old-timers, who couldn't adapt to a world where profit margins mattered more than street corners. She brought in accountants and lawyers, MBAs and consultants, transforming what had been a criminal enterprise into a corporate entity that just happened to have unconventional roots. The gambling moved online and into partnerships with tribal casinos. The labor unions focused on skilled trades and technology sectors. The real estate developments qualified for tax incentives and urban renewal grants. Everything profitable, everything documented, everything clean. It was boring, some of the old guard complained. Where was the excitement, the risk, the fire? Sitting in federal prison cells, Isabella thought, but never said aloud. On the corner of her desk, amid spreadsheets and development proposals, sat the shattered porcelain doll. She'd had it removed from the restaurant floor and brought to her office, its fractured pieces carefully preserved in a glass display case. The other wives had whispered about it. Morbid, they called it. A gruesome memento. They didn't understand. The doll wasn't a memento of death. It was a reminder of the moment everything changed, when the careful facade of helplessness shattered and revealed the sharp edges beneath. In a world built on violence and intimidation, where men measured power by body count and territory, the doll represented a different kind of strength. Intelligence, patience, the willingness to be underestimated until the moment you strike. Antonio had understood that. He'd built an empire not with brutality but with strategy, with the recognition that true power came from controlling the systems rather than the streets. And Isabella had learned from the master, absorbing every lesson until she could execute them better than he ever had. She was 34 years old. She controlled assets worth hundreds of millions. She had the respect of the commission, and the fear of anyone who might challenge her. And she'd achieved it all by being exactly what those men couldn't imagine. Smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than any of them. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Russo, the planning commission is ready for your call." Isabella pressed the button, her eyes lingering on the shattered doll for one more moment. "Thank you, Jennifer. Put them through." As she reached for the phone, she caught her reflection in the darkening window. The woman looking back wasn't the one who'd cowered in that restaurant booth. That woman was gone, shattered like porcelain on a restaurant floor. What remained was something far more dangerous. A woman who understood that in a world obsessed with violence, the deadliest weapon had always been the mind. The cemetery was quiet on Tuesday mornings. Isabella had learned this over the past 6 months, discovering that the early weekday hours offered a solitude the weekends never could. She preferred it this way. No curious glances from other mourners, no whispered speculation about the young widow in the designer coat visiting her husband's grave. Antonio's headstone was simple, elegant. Black granite with gold lettering that read only his name and dates, nothing about what he'd been or what he'd built. He would have appreciated the discretion. The ostentatious monuments nearby, with their weeping angels and elaborate epitaphs, would have made him smile that dry, knowing smile she still saw sometimes in her dreams. Isabella settled onto the stone bench facing his grave, pulling her coat tighter against the October chill. The trees were releasing their leaves in slow motion, carpeting the grounds in rust and gold. Antonio had died in spring, when everything was beginning. Now autumn was here, and she'd come to tell him about endings and beginnings both. "I finished it," she said quietly, her voice carrying no further than his headstone. "Everything you started. Vittorio's gone. Marco's locked away. The operations are legitimate, profitable, growing. The Don himself told me last week that you'd be proud." She paused, allowing herself a small smile. "Though I think we both know you already knew I could do this. You always saw me more clearly than I saw myself." The cardinal landed on a nearby monument, its red plumage shocking against the gray stone. Isabella watched it for a moment before continuing. "They're calling me the Ice Queen now. Did you know that? The men who used to pat my hand and call me sweetheart when I brought you papers to sign now won't meet my eyes in meetings. I've made more in 6 months than some of them have made in 6 years, and they can't decide whether to hate me for it or propose business partnerships." She laughed softly. "Usually both." The cardinal took flight, disappearing into the oak trees that lined the cemetery's eastern edge. Isabella's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, still flat beneath the cashmere coat, holding a secret only she and her doctor knew. "There's something else," she said, her voice softer now. "Something I discovered about 2 weeks after that night. I'm pregnant, Antonio. 15 weeks now. A girl, they tell me." She felt the familiar sting of tears, but didn't let them fall. She'd cried enough in the first month. Now there was only the strange, bittersweet ache of joy he'd never share. "She'll never know you, not the way I did. But I'll tell her about you. Not the legend, not the stories they'll whisper in certain circles. The truth." A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the remaining leaves and carrying the scent of approaching rain. Isabella breathed it in, gathering her thoughts. "I'll tell her that her father's greatest act wasn't building an empire, or surviving in a world of wolves. It was trusting that his wife was strong enough, smart enough, and ruthless enough to win a war he couldn't finish. That takes a special kind of courage, Antonio. The courage to let go of control, to bet everything on someone else's strength." She paused, remembering his face in those final moments, the way he'd looked at her with absolute certainty. "You gave me permission to stop pretending. That doll, the insurance policy, all of it. It wasn't just strategy. It was your way of telling me I didn't have to be harmless anymore, that I could stop hiding what I was." She thought about the shattered porcelain in its glass case, about the woman she'd pretended to be for 6 years. Sweet Isabella, quiet Isabella, the pretty wife who smiled and nodded, and never quite understood what her husband really did. It had been such a careful performance, honed over years of watching, learning, waiting for the moment when that facade might become a weapon. Antonio had seen through it from the beginning, she realized now. He'd known exactly who she was, what she was capable of becoming, and instead of feeling threatened, instead of trying to keep her small and safe and ornamental, he'd cultivated that dangerous intelligence, fed it with information, with responsibility, with trust. He'd turned his wife into his successor, without anyone noticing, least of all the men who thought they were watching his every move. "The quiet women everyone ignores," Isabella said, almost to herself. "We see everything, Antonio. We remember everything. And we know exactly when to use what we've learned." She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her coat. "You taught me that. Or maybe you just recognized it in me and gave me permission to stop hiding it." The sky was darkening now, clouds rolling in from the east. Rain soon, the kind of cold autumn rain that would strip the remaining leaves from the trees and leave everything bare. Isabella didn't mind. There was something cleansing about it, something that felt like transition. "Our daughter will grow up in a different world," she continued, placing one hand on the cool granite of his headstone. "Legitimate businesses, legal profits, no looking over our shoulders. But I'll make sure she understands where she comes from. The intelligence, the strategy, the willingness to let others underestimate you until the precise moment you strike. Those are her inheritance. Not territory or fear, but the understanding that power isn't about who shouts loudest or hits hardest. It's about who thinks deepest and waits longest." She could almost hear his voice, dry and warm. "You always were smarter than me, Isabella. I just had the good sense to recognize it. I miss you," she whispered, allowing herself this one vulnerability in a place where no one could see. "I miss talking through problems with you. I miss the way you'd listen to my ideas and actually consider them instead of dismissing them because I was a woman. I miss—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I miss my partner. But I promise you, I'll be the partner our daughter needs. I'll teach her everything you taught me, and everything I've learned since you've been gone." The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and clean. Isabella didn't move, letting them dot her coat, her hair, feeling them like a baptism. "They thought I was harmless," she said, her voice stronger now. "All those men, all those years. They thought I was decoration, an accessory to your power. And I let them think it because I understood something they didn't, that being underestimated is the most powerful position in the world. You can plan, prepare, position yourself perfectly, and they never see it coming. By the time they realize what you are, it's too late." She thought of Vittorio's face when he realized she'd been the one gathering evidence against him. Marco's expression when the witnesses he'd paid off suddenly developed consciences. The Don's grudging respect when he understood that Antonio's quiet wife had been the true architect of their transformation. "Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is let everyone underestimate her," Isabella said, "right up until the moment she destroys them. You knew that, didn't you? You counted on it." The rain was falling harder now, but Isabella stood a moment longer, her hand still resting on his headstone. She had an empire to run, a future to build, a daughter to prepare for a world that still didn't expect women to be dangerous. "Thank you," she whispered finally, "for seeing me, for trusting me, for teaching me that intelligence is the deadliest weapon, and patience is its perfect complement. I'll make sure our daughter knows that her father was the rarest kind of man, one strong enough to stand beside a woman who was his equal, and wise enough to prepare her to surpass him. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back one final time at the simple granite marker that held his name. I love you, Antonio Russo. And I promise you, everything you built, everything you believed in, everything you trusted me to finish, it's safe. Our daughter will inherit not an empire of violence, but a legacy of intelligence and strategy, and the understanding that true power whispers while weakness shouts. Isabella walked back through the rain to her car, where her driver waited with the engine running. She slid into the back seat, accepting the towel he offered with a nod of thanks. As they pulled away from the cemetery, she glanced back one last time at the trees, the monuments, the quiet resting place of the man who'd changed everything. The shattered doll sat in its case in her office. Their daughter grew in her womb. The city stretched before her, full of opportunity and challenge, and the endless game of power that Antonio had taught her to play better than anyone imagined. She was ready. She'd always been ready. Antonio had simply been wise enough to know it. Thank you for experiencing Isabella's journey with us. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the tension, the strategy, the quiet power of a woman who refused to be underestimated, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another compelling narrative like this one. Drop a comment below and let me know. What was your favorite moment? Was it Isabella's transformation? Antonio's final act of trust? The shattered porcelain doll? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts on these complex characters and their choices. And if you think someone else would appreciate this story, a friend who loves psychological thrillers, a family member who enjoys tales of strategy and resilience, anyone who appreciates narratives about underestimated people claiming their power, please share this video. Stories are meant to be shared, and your support helps this channel grow. More gripping stories are coming soon. Subscribe, comment, and share, and I'll see you in the next narrative.